This program contains graphic descriptions of violence. Viewer discretion is advised.
Do you think that gives the family closure? It was a moral issue when it comes to life and death.
Is it gonna save some money for the state?
Should Nebraska have the death penalty? This fall, you'll have the opportunity to vote on this. To help you better understand this issue, we took the discussion to community college classrooms throughout the state. We brought advocates from each side to answer student questions. These conversations brought out many aspects of this complex, emotional issue in a way we hope will better inform your vote. First, though, where Nebraska stands on the death penalty and why it's on the ballot.
This is rather a solemn day here in this chamber, and it should be.
Mr. President, Senator Chambers would move that Legislative Bill 268 become law, notwithstanding the objections of the governor.
It was a day of drama, emotion, history.
This is not a partisan vote. This is a vote of conscience, a vote of faith.
For a minute, let's get down to our souls, our cores, our guts.
The Nebraska State Legislature voted to abolish the death penalty.
The action that we take will definitely be historic.
The arguments were as old as the state itself. From the day the borders were set, Nebraska law approved of capital punishment. The gallows gave way to the electric chair in 1913. For advocates of the death penalty, each decade provided a horrific example of why the ultimate punishment was needed. Starkweather, Joubert, the Norfolk bank murders. But the method of execution had to change. In 2008, death by electrocution was ruled unconstitutional by the Nebraska Supreme Court, a form of cruel and unusual punishment. The state legislature authorized lethal injection as the punishment for capital murder cases. The prison hasn't found a reliable source for the dwindling supply of legal execution drugs. Death row inmates delayed executions with appeals. In recent years, death sentences were routinely upheld by the state Supreme Court, but county prosecutors were less and less likely to seek the death penalty.
The state should not kill. That is not the purpose of the state.
The political opposition, led by Senator Ernie Chambers, never let up, but year after year, a majority of senators stuck with the death penalty.
Potential criminals, there is a real easy way to avoid ever getting the death penalty. Don't kill anyone else.
It was different last year. The votes were there.
Are you interested in signing a petition to get the death penalty put on the ballot so that Nebraska has an opportunity to vote? Yes.
No sooner had the vote been cast than defenders of capital punishment launched a petition drive. Thousands of Nebraskans responded, giving voters the choice to retain the legislature's repeal of the death penalty or to put capital punishment back into state law.
Let's start with some of our discussion from Western Nebraska Community College, with a class of students studying ethics and current issues in philosophy.
The list that I read through of the inmates that are on death row in the state of Nebraska, the crimes that they committed to the children were horrible. You know, being a mother of two, if somebody did that to my children, I would hope that they would, they could get what was coming to them. So how would you describe to a mother that life in prison is morally justifiable?
I would never tell a mother how to feel about the death penalty. If their child was murdered, they get to feel whatever they want about the death penalty. What I would say, though, is that there's so few cases where the death penalty is sought that essentially what we're telling is to some mothers, your child's murder was heinous, and to another mother who's grieving just as badly, your child's murder was just common. We so rarely seek the death penalty in this state that that's essentially what we're communicating to these grieving mothers. The other thing that we're not doing is we're not fully explaining to these mothers what they're signing up for with the death penalty. Because essentially, they're signing up for 20, 30 years of appeals, where every couple of years, the press is going to call them and ask them for their reaction, and it's going to reopen this wound. I grew up here, and I will never forget when Adam Gomez was murdered. We heard the details over and over on the news. I slept with my lights on for a couple weeks because I was terrified in this community.
Briefly, what I would say is that these arguments about we don't do it that often can just as easily be used in service of the argument that we ought to do it more often. And sometimes I think to myself, well, if we had hangings, if we had 3 hangings every Saturday, would that be a satisfactory rate in order to take this argument away? I'm not unhappy with the fact that we're very careful about when and how we impose it. And I don't think that that undermines the deterrence argument based upon the studies that I've seen.
I understand that it is currently impossible to get the chemicals that are necessary to use our method of capital punishment. How do you propose to go forward and find a usable method?
I don't personally have a proposal. I feel that if we retain the death penalty and send the message back that a usable approach will be found. I know that there are usable approaches because we see states where the death penalty continues to be carried out. Nebraska selected a protocol the federal government was using. If there are difficulties obtaining those drugs, there are other ways to approach the question of what drugs are to be used and how they're to be prepared, and there are other states that have these other approaches. We can address that, and our state can find a solution to it as other states have.
Almost 4 years ago now, to date, the FDA told Nebraska that they had to surrender the illegal drugs that they obtained. And here we are 4 years later with a different governor who went to the same drug dealer to try and get the drugs. And we're still going through that battle. And so I very much believe that if there were a way to fix this, we would have done so by now. We had governors who very much wanted to execute, and they just weren't able to find the legal means to do it. Now he talks about how different states are finding a way to execute. I don't think Nebraska wants to go down that path because those states have given up government transparency. They've passed secrecy laws to ensure that no one can know what's in the drugs, where they came from.
You brought up deterrence earlier and said that you had some statistics talking about that. Could we get into those? Because everything that I've read and heard talks about the fact that criminals don't think by logic. They don't use logic, and also states like Texas that send multiple people to death row still have incredibly high crime rates. So could we get into your statistics?
This is a law review article that was written by Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule. These are people who are kind of regarded as libertarians. They're professors at the University of Chicago. And they wrote an article called Is Capital Punishment Morally Required? Acts, Omissions, and Life Trade-Offs. The data is that one of the studies they did spanned a 20-year period of time and covered 3,054 counties. And in that study, what they found was a strong statistical link between the existence of the death penalty and the reduction of first-degree murder. The relationship is strong, the relationship is robust, and by their estimate, on the average, an execution saves 18 innocent lives. They found a strong relationship between a sentence of death and the saving of innocent lives.
I think there's been a lot of discussion about these studies about deterrence over the years. And so finally, a group of scientists got together at the National Research Council and gathered all of these studies together that have been done up through 2012 is when this finding was released. And ultimately, What they concluded based on looking at all the studies, looking at the methodology, looking at the statistics, looking at the findings, looking at who conducted it, and making sure things were done in a scientific fashion, they said that at best it's inconclusive, that there's really no way for us to know for sure whether the death penalty deters murder, if it actually saves lives, or if it actually increases homicides. Their conclusion is claims that research demonstrates that capital punishment decreases or increases the homicide rate or has no effect on it should not influence policy judgments about capital punishment, because the findings are so inconclusive and the studies are all over the map, including the studies that Bob is citing.
At Metro Community College in Omaha, we brought our discussion to students from 2 classes, Ethics and Human Services.
Do you think that more correction officers will get killed if you take away the death penalty? Do you think it'll be a fear for their safety?
No, I don't. Why? And I represent hundreds of corrections officers. With all due respect to people sitting in prison, they're not the brightest people in the world, okay? And they're not thinking about, geez, if I do this, will somebody kill me? That's giving them a lot more credit than I believe. And I talk to corrections officers all the time. They don't need the death penalty hanging over an inmate's head to keep them in line. If it did, look, Texas executes more people per capita than any other state, right? If hanging the death penalty over a person's head were effective, you could go to Texas and not worry about being robbed, killed, anything like that. Okay, the jury's out, and I don't think anybody thinks that. The science has been pretty clear. Nobody thinks that a threat of the death penalty prevents crime.
I'd like to respond as well. On the one hand, I would hope not. On the other hand, I just look at it logically. If you're already in prison for a life sentence, 1 or more life sentences, and we got well over 100 folks that are, once you got a life sentence, what's killing a guard going to do? Then if they take you to court, you're going to get another life sentence, but you only got 1 life, so you're just going to be there. There's no reason not to kill a prison guard if you're already in for a life sentence, other than there's a good chance you get the death penalty if you do.
When you put somebody on death row and they die, do you think that gives the family closure? Because they've already lost, because they've already lost their family members. So do you think it's closure for them?
I don't think it's the same for every single person. My experience as Attorney General, the one I remember most was the Willie Otay case. And his victim was a young lady by the name of Jane McManus. And in that case, he came into her home. She's lying on the couch. He said, "I'm going to rob and rape you." She struggled, so he slashed her across the forehead, and she was bleeding profusely. Then he raped her. Then he made her walk upstairs to get her purse, and then got the purse. Then he stabbed her multiple times. Then he beat her over the head with a hammer, and then he strangled her to death. And he got the death penalty. The sister of the victim was a lady by the name of Laura McManus. And I got to know her very, very well because she wanted justice for her sister. And so she was involved in talking to the news media. Before an execution can be carried out, an inmate has a statutory right to a pardon board hearing. So we had that. She came and testified basically in support of her sister. And I know that she was very glad to see justice done. I know there are some families, I didn't personally deal with anyone like that as Attorney General, but I know they're there. They're opposed to the death penalty and don't want to see it carried out. So
you asked a question about victims, families, and I'm like Mr. Simberg, I've talked to victims on both sides, and there's certainly victims on both sides, but under the current system we have now, your question is, will they get closure? Here's my answer. We'll never know, because it'll never happen. We don't know. We have victims' families out there who want to see an execution. I've met them. They'll never know if they'll get closure because their family's killer isn't going to be executed. And we have victims' families out there who want to move on with their life, and they want to just know that their loved one's killer has been put in a place where they'll never get out and never hurt anybody else again. But they don't get closure either because those individuals, their family's killer has been sentenced to death. And every so often, there's an appeal and it hits the newspaper and they get, what they tell me is that's like reopening a wound. I got to read in the paper what happened to my loved one.
When you think death penalty, is it gonna save some money for the state?
From the Attorney General's office standpoint that handles all these appeals, the cost isn't really that much different in a life sentence versus a death sentence because you get the appeals in either event. The defense costs tend to be the same. The one thing that may be different in some cases is the capital case, the trial. You have not only the guilt phase, you have the aggravating circumstances that the jury has to hear if a jury trial is requested, and so there's additional expense. And then on the other side, if a death sentence were actually carried out, obviously the time in prison would be considerably less.
I'm gonna blow your mind here. He's right. It would save money if we could execute people, but we don't do it. We don't do it. We could save money if the punishment was right after the sentence, but it's not that way. And it would save money. It would be cheaper when a person was convicted and sentenced to put them to death. And if we did it, we would save money, but we don't do it, so we've wasted a lot of money.
Are you concerned at all with executing the wrong person, or the evidence is so concrete when somebody's on death row that it's not really an issue?
Well, again, I'm going to focus on Nebraska because I know Nebraska's system. As far as I know, there's no history, certainly in the last 60, 70 years, of anybody being on death row where there was any question whatsoever of their guilt. The system is very, very careful, I think always, but especially in death penalty cases. And I think if there were any doubt, if a prosecutor had any doubt, and of course they got to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the person did it. If they have any doubt at all, they're not going to ask for the death penalty if they have any doubt at all, even if they might go ahead with the case and let the jury decide it.
We got 10 guys on death row. None of them are sitting there saying I didn't do it.
Right.
They're all said guilty.
Well, they were all found guilty. Now their attorneys are very smart, and they're not out there saying I did it, but none of them are out there trying to appeal on a basis that they didn't do it. Okay, so that's the Nebraska experience. But I will tell you this, there are a couple hundred citizens of the United States walking around the country today who spent anywhere from 2 years to 40 years on death row for a crime they didn't commit. Okay? That number is in the hundreds. We're not talking about a few people. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people. Let me tell you, this could it happen? It could. And I'll give you an example. Beatrice 6 was a group of people who were all tried and convicted of the rape and murder of a very old woman. They combined did couple hundred years. Some of them served their time and got out because they drove the car. Others were still in prison. The Attorney General at the time found some DNA evidence through investigation. He had a press conference and he let 6 people out, or a couple people out of prison, and he said, look, these people didn't do it. And that was a good thing that justice was finally served, and I was happy about that. The next year they come in front of the committee where I serve, because we had a bill in front of our committee that's going to give $500,000 to people who were convicted erroneously because of malfeasance by them. And I was pretty skeptical, and they came up to the committee hearing and they said to me, they said, we're an advocate. We think we ought to have this, you ought to pass this bill so we can get this money. And I was honest with them, and I said, 5 of you 6 said you did it. 5 of the 6 people, only one guy ever maintained his innocence. But 5 of them said they did it, even though DNA eventually proved that they didn't. And I looked him in the eye and I said, you got to tell me how you would admit to a crime you didn't do, because that blows my mind, right? And thankfully I've never been in that position. And their answer was, I was starting with the death penalty. They said if I didn't admit to committing this crime, they were going to kill me, right? Now let's say that they hadn't done it. They'd be on death row. We know today that they would have been executed erroneously.
At Northeast Community College in Norfolk, the 2002 bank shooting that left 5 dead and 3 on death row was still on the minds of some American government and criminal investigation students.
First, I want to make a comment that I was in school 8 blocks away from the bank shooting. The house across the street where they broke in and stole the vehicle was across the road from my house. It says in the Bible, an eye for an eye. What is your opinion on that?
I think a lot of us as Midwesterners, as Nebraskans, probably grew up in families of faith. Certainly, I think most of us understand and been taught from a young age that killing is wrong. But here is where we're at today. I think you've seen an evolution of opinions from faith leaders. Some have always opposed the death penalty. For example, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, which a large population of Catholic members in Nebraska, the Catholic Church is against the death penalty. You rarely see Catholic bishops take a strong stand on a moral issue like this, other than maybe abortion. And so all three of the Nebraska's Catholic bishops have spoken out against the death penalty. And I think for those of you who are Catholic, we'll probably continue to hear that. I think some of the mainstream Methodist and other Protestant faiths have traditionally been against the death penalty, and they've been strong opponents of the death penalty here in Nebraska. I happen to come from more of a, I don't like labels, but more of an evangelical or non-denominational background. People in my faith communities are beginning to change their opinion on the death penalty.
You know, the Bible pretty clearly calls for the death penalty in certain instances. I don't think that's disputable. I don't think that the Catholic Church is opposed to the death penalty. I'm not Catholic either, but I see that there are archbishops of the Catholic Church who have said that the death penalty is fundamental to the observance of the sixth commandment, which is thou shalt not murder. So it seems to me that there's a strong biblical impetus for the death penalty, but not in every case. Look, you take a look at Micah. Micah was a prophet. Micah is a prophet that there's a book of Micah in the Old Testament, and there's a famous quote from Micah, and it says, you know what God expects of you, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. What does this mean? To do justice. That means that people are to be held accountable for their actions. They're to be held accountable for the acts that they choose to engage in. To love mercy. That means that you should show mercy to people when you're judging them. To walk humbly before your God. Don't get arrogant about it. You better have some humility about what you're about, because otherwise you could make a mistake, and you don't want to make a mistake about this. So there are moral, biblical underpinnings to what we're doing here, and they find expression in the statutes of our state.
What if your child was one of his victims? How would you feel if you would know that at some point in time that this man could be getting out?
The fact of the matter is, at least in Nebraska, life means life. Life without parole means life in prison until your natural death. And we've seen...
I'm going to be taking issue with that in just a second.
Good, good. And so I think that's a common feeling as citizens of how we'd be protected. But I go back to earlier, the suggestion that over the past 20 years, we've not had a death penalty in Nebraska. We've not carried out a sentence of death in Nebraska for 20 years. Does that make us feel less safe? What has been the impact of that?
Let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, we have a pardons board in this state. It's a 3-member board, and they have a right to commute sentence. That means that they can take a sentence, whatever you've served already, they can say that's enough, you can be released. Or they can commute it to a time, they did this, I'll tell you about a case in a second, where you could be released later this year. They can commute sentences to time served. The Pardons Board can pardon people completely. The Pardons Board is unreviewable. There's no court review. The Pardons Board is a very, very powerful body. Now, about 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, the Pardons Board took a guy who had been sentenced to life for being one of 3 people who committed a murder, a really terrible murder. He was 70 years old, and the Pardons Board decided that they would commute his sentence to a term so that he could be paroled. He was paroled almost immediately, and a few months after his parole, he sexually molested a 10-year-old girl. And now he's back in prison for that felony. There is no such thing as life without release or life without parole.
I feel like a moral issue is a moral issue when it comes to life and death. So, like the legislation taking the death penalty off the table and all the citizens having to gather together to put it back on the table. But at the same time that we're talking about having a vote about this, I read and heard that we're talking about death with dignity in the legislature, and abortion rights are constantly being looked at. In my mind, I can't gather why we can consider one thing immoral, but still be open to other things.
I think there is this conflict between the death penalty and abortion. I think and again, we go back to the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church teaches life is life. And how do we justify the state taking the life of someone who, yes, is guilty and admits guilt, but yet we spend all this effort to try to protect an innocent life that's not born? So I personally have struggled with that through the years, and I feel much better having landed now for life for both of those individuals.
I don't see how you can compare the innocence of a baby in the womb, a human life in the womb. Is there any more innocent person than that with a craven, heinous, calculated killer? These are not the same case to me. I don't have trouble making the distinction between those two. And I think if you really are respectful of life, then you will come to the conclusion that the death penalty is an important thing for law enforcement to have.
We'll end with a few final thoughts from our experts from each side of the issue.
If we're a moral people, then the death penalty is an appropriate penalty for us for the worst cases, judiciously applied.
All 150 people who have been exonerated from death row in this country looked incredibly guilty until we found new evidence to suggest otherwise.
I think there's a deterrent effect for some people in the death penalty. I think it does help public safety.
We haven't been able to execute anybody in 20 years. And I'm choosing my position based on my compassion for the victims, that they deserve a system that does what it says it's going to do.
The answer here is not to throw out the death penalty. The answer is to fix the system. And it is fixable because we see this in other states.
Do we really want to bring back a system that is costly, not only in dollars and cents, but costly to the victims and the family members of victims to endure year after year of no justice?
Visit our website to watch more of our classroom conversations and for more information about the death penalty issue. Then cast your vote during the general election this fall. The ballot language may be confusing, so here's a simple guide. If you are against the death penalty, vote retain. If you are for the death penalty, vote repeal. Early voting begins in October. Election Day is November 8th.